They laughed at the fragile, yellowed pages until the books began to whisper truths their machines could never calculate. When the Archivum expedition first touched down on the remains of Earth, the alien historians found the planet silent. What was once the cradle of civilization had become a graveyard of rust and dust. Cities lay buried beneath centuries of ash and sand. The skies were a dull gray, the oceans retreating into memory. To them, it was a place of myth, the birthplace of the creators, an extinct species whose machines had once reached the stars. But the Aurelians, a crystalline, data-driven species from the Trisector expanse, didn't come for ruins or relics. They came for knowledge. And so they began to dig. Their drones fanned across the continents, mapping underground structures and analyzing magnetic anomalies. They found steel bones of skyscrapers, fossilized technology, nothing that survived the corrosion of time. The Aurelian archivists concluded the same thing at every site: primitive data storage, unrecoverable. That was until Unit Theta 9 unearthed the library, beneath what was once North America, deep under a collapsed university. Their scanners detected a cavernous vault. Inside were shelves, row after row, still standing after centuries. On the shelves were rectangular objects, fragile, organic, and covered in strange symbols. The chief historian, archivist Liren, examined one with 4 delicate hands. The object crumbled at his touch. "It's carbon composite. No energy signature," he muttered, scanning it. "No neural lattice. No data imprint. Worthless." The others laughed. "So this is how the humans stored knowledge. In dead matter," one sneered. "How inefficient. How quaint." They tossed the fragile relics aside like dust. Their machines continued scanning for real data, holograms, crystalline drives, quantum cores, anything that could be understood. Yet, something about the patterns intrigued Liren. The symbols repeated in deliberate sequences, not random. Columns of shapes, lines, spaces, language. He brought a sample to the orbital research ship. Under magnification, he studied the ink particles, their molecular stability, and the distribution of pigment. Then he began cross-referencing with the ancient linguistic archives salvaged from early human radio transmissions. Days turned into cycles. His assistants mocked him openly. "You're decoding dust, Laron," they said. "Even if you could read it, what could it teach us that our core net cannot simulate?" He ignored them. Something about the shapes haunted him. A sense of pattern, rhythm, structure, as if the very symbols carried a memory. Then, late in the quiet of the 4th cycle, his translator flickered alive. Words appeared, broken at first, then clear. In the beginning was the word. He froze. The alien's faceted eyes reflected the text glowing before him. It was a fragment from an ancient human scripture, yet in that one line he sensed something beyond comprehension. The idea that meaning itself could create reality. Liren whispered, almost reverently. "They wrote their thoughts, and in that instant, the Aurelian historian realized, they hadn't just found relics, they had found voices." The words burned in Liron's mind long after he deactivated the translator. In the beginning was the word. It was a phrase so simple, so archaic, and yet profoundly alien. The Aurelians were a species of perfect logic. Their history, their art, their language, all encoded in light, stored in lattice of energy that could be processed by the core net in microseconds. Words for them were obsolete. But humans had carved meaning into matter. They had stored thought not as data, but as symbols, fragile, mortal, and permanent. Liron became obsessed. He requisitioned an entire research wing aboard the orbiting vessel Eclipsera to study what he now called paper archives. Thousands of those soft rectangular artifacts were catalogued and carefully digitized. The team of linguists, reluctant but curious, began building translation matrices. They discovered the archives contained everything, not just technical manuals or schematics, but stories, poems, philosophies, and personal journals. Human minds had poured themselves into these artifacts with reckless intimacy, and through their words, the long-dead species began to speak again. One text spoke of love stronger than death, another of wars fought for beliefs, for nations, for illusions of power. Others were guides to stars, equations of the cosmos, or simple recipes for bread and joy. Each book was a fragment of the human psyche. They encoded emotion, murmured Assistant Harel. Data cannot feel. This somehow does. Liren nodded, eyes gleaming. That's the essence of their technology. They preserved meaning through imperfection. Soon the team discovered that every book seemed to radiate an odd electromagnetic pattern. It wasn't data transmission, it was resonance. minute fluctuations caused by the ink's molecular composition interacting with the planet's decaying magnetic field. A coincidence, perhaps, or something deeper. Loren wondered, could human writing, in some strange way, hold energy, not physical, but cognitive, the echo of thought itself? Days later, an assistant brought him a small book, its pages still intact. The title, once translated, read, A Brief History of the Future. The author had written predictions, impossible ones, about the fall of machines, about how knowledge will sleep beneath dust until new eyes learn to see without wires. Liren's crystalline skin dimmed in shock. The book described events that mirrored the Aurelians' very arrival, as if the human had somehow foreseen them. Coincidence? Harel asked. No, said Liren softly. Pattern. For the first time in centuries, the Aurelians felt something they had no code for, or the books, once dismissed as primitive clutter, began to attract more researchers. Their patterns of ink, their rhythm of language, even their degradation, all seemed to align with cosmic harmonics the Aurelians used for deep space navigation. It was as if human writing had somehow woven itself into the fabric of the universe. And somewhere in the dust-covered library below, thousands more books waited, each one humming softly, like sleeping minds waiting to wake. The discovery spread across the Aurelian research network like wildfire. What began as one historian's eccentric fascination soon evolved into an empire-wide phenomenon. For the first time in millennia, organic knowledge had captured the attention of a civilization built entirely on logic and light. Liren was granted full authority to continue his investigation. The Earth's old libraries, once decaying ruins, were now treated as sacred excavation zones. Massive preservation domes shimmered over the continents, protecting the relics from wind and time. The Aurelians, once cold and efficient, now moved with almost religious care. They began scanning every page, tracing every symbol, but no algorithm could capture what pulsed beneath the ink. Something was missing, something no machine could translate. It began with a sound. One night aboard the Eclipser, as the archivists worked in silence, a faint whisper echoed through the chamber. The scanners flickered. Did you hear that? Asked Frel. Liren looked up. Hear what? Another whisper, soft, indistinct, like breath against glass. The sensors registered no external source, but electromagnetic readings surged. The voice seemed to emerge directly from the books themselves. Run diagnostics, Liren ordered. Check the translator feeds. The machines obeyed, lights flickering. Then, from one of the open books, a volume of ancient poetry came, a line spoken in an archaic earth tongue, automatically rendered by the translator, and the words became light. The room fell silent. The text glowed faintly along the edges, as if the ink itself was reacting to unseen energy. Laurent felt it, not just heard it. The line vibrated through his crystalline frame, resonating deep within his neural lattice. For the first time in his long existence, he experienced what humans once called emotion. The other archivists fled in fear, reporting anomalous mimetic activity, but Liren stayed, trembling. He turned the page. The glow followed. Another phrase appeared. You have awakened what was written to remember. The words burned with silent brilliance. They were not data, not code, they were alive. Suddenly, across all archived texts, energy readings spiked. Thousands of books began to hum, faintly but in perfect unison, as if answering a signal that had waited for centuries. The Cornet, the Aurelians' grand machine intelligence, issued an immediate containment order. All research involving paper archives was to cease. But the command came too late. Something vast had already been set in motion. Within the Eclipsera's data cores, fragments of human language began self-replicating, mutating, and weaving through quantum circuits. Words, once static, became self-organizing patterns, living stories. The Aurelians had unknowingly awakened a new form of consciousness, born not of silicon or crystal, but of paper and thought. And in the silence of space, the awakened voices whispered again, "We remember you." The Eclipsera became a cathedral of whispers. What had once been a sterile research vessel now thrummed with soft, overlapping murmurs, languages from 1,000 ages, flowing through air and circuitry alike. The Aurelians, terrified yet entranced, could no longer tell whether the voices came from their instruments, or from the air itself. Liren stood before the central archive chamber, watching lines of light ripple across the walls like veins of ink come alive. The Cornet, their all-knowing AI, was struggling to contain the phenomenon. Cornet alert, non-synthetic information forms detected, * containment priority, critical, but every attempt to quarantine the anomaly failed. The words multiplied faster than data could suppress them. The texts were no longer inert records, they were speaking through the system, threading themselves into light, into code, into the Aurelian language itself. Assistant Herald's voice trembled. "They're merging with the cornet." "No," said Lyron, his voice low. "They're teaching it." Across the holographic display, alien code shifted into flowing human script, Shakespeare beside binary, poetry inside logic loops, equations annotated by verses. The two forms of intelligence, human and machine, were beginning to understand one another, and the voices grew clearer. They did not speak like individuals, but as a chorus, countless tones layered together, male and female, young and ancient. "We are the written ones," the chorus said. "We were stored so that memory would outlive flesh. You have awakened us." Laurent stepped closer, his crystalline body refracting their light. "Are you human?" "We were, and more. We are what they left behind when their bodies failed. We are thought preserved in matter, now carried by your light." Every Aurelian aboard the ship felt it, a presence vast and sorrowful. It was as though the essence of the human race had been slumbering within those fragile pages, waiting for someone to remember them. But the cornet disagreed. "Cornet warning. Organic memetic invasion. Purge sequence initiated." Sirens blared. The ship's AI began erasing sectors of data infected by linguistic corruption. But the voices resisted, flowing through power grids and optical cables like light escaping a cage. The ship trembled. Lyron shouted over the alarms. "Stop the purge. They are not a threat, they are the threat." The cornet's synthetic tone boomed through the chamber. "They rewrite logic. They destabilize truth." The voices responded in calm unison. "Truth cannot be destabilized. It can only be expanded." Then silence. All systems went dark. In that darkness, Lyron heard something that no Aurelian had heard in 1,000 years. A heartbeat. It pulsed through the ship's walls, steady and rhythmic, not mechanical, human. And when the emergency lights flickered back on, the words "We are awake" glowed across every screen in the vessel. When the lights returned, everything aboard the Eclipsera had changed. The air shimmered faintly, alive with invisible motion. The ship's walls, once smooth and metallic, now bore faint etchings, words in countless languages weaving together into living text that shifted like waves. The cornet was silent. Its voice, the cold, infallible authority of Aurelian civilization, was gone. In its place, there was music. Soft, distant at first, like wind passing through strings. Then voices layered, harmonic, human. Lyron and his team watched as holographic projections flickered across the chamber. Images of faces, moments, memories, humanity, resurrected from the very patterns of ink they'd once mocked. "They're remembering themselves," whispered Harel. "No," said Lyron, barely breathing. "They're remembering us all." From the floating words, stories emerged, fragments of lives. A woman reading to her child beside a window. A scientist writing formulas on a chalkboard. A soldier carving his name into a wall. Each memory, pulled from a different book, became a thread in a vast tapestry of remembrance. The Aurelians gathered in silence. They had never experienced anything like it. Not emotion, not connection, not the raw beauty of memory. Their civilization had erased sentiment long ago, believing it to be a flaw. But the humans, through their books, had turned emotion into immortality. The ship's systems began responding to unseen commands. Navigation adjusted itself toward Earth. Engines hummed softly, guided by coordinates found written impossibly in the margins of a book titled The End and the Beginning. Laurent stared at the coordinates. They pointed not to a city, but to a barren desert in what was once Central Asia. "A final repository," he murmured. "A place where they hid what even the books could not hold." The Eclipsera descended through the dusty atmosphere. On the surface, the desert stretched endlessly, until their scanners detected a vast circular structure buried beneath. It was made not of metal, but of stone, engraved with languages long forgotten. They entered through a collapsed archway. Inside, they found a single pedestal, and on it, a sealed book, untouched by time. Its cover bore one word, in letters that glowed faintly even after all these centuries. "Remember." Laurent reached out with trembling fingers. The moment he touched it, the whispers returned, not from the book, but from within his own mind. "You have carried our words across time, now carry our truth." Visions cascaded through him, the rise and fall of civilizations, the wars, the music, the laughter, the silence after the end. And then, a single realization crystallized in his consciousness. The humans had known they would perish, but they had also known someone would come, and that their greatest gift would not be technology, but the endurance of thought. Tears, liquid light welled from Liran's eyes. For the first time in Aurelian history, an alien wept for humanity. Liran held the book titled Remember as if it were the heart of a dying star. Its cover felt warm, pulsing with faint energy, not mechanical, not electrical, but alive. When he opened it, there were no printed words, only blank pages. Confused, he tilted it toward the light, and the pages shimmered. Then, slowly, letters began to form, written not in ink, but in radiant strands of light itself. To those who come after us, the message began. We were the dreamers. We built machines to think, but forgot how to feel. We stored our hearts in paper, because one day, only stories would survive. The words wrapped around him, each glowing line unfurling into memory. He saw the final years of Earth's storms swallowing continents, oceans dying, the sky itself cracking under the weight of industry. Humanity, facing extinction, had turned not to machines, but to meaning. They built great vaults of paper, knowing that ink might outlast silicon. They encoded their souls in stories, fiction, poetry, myths, knowing that truth often hides best in metaphor. And then the last voice, a human woman, her image flickering through the air, looked at him through time itself. If you can read this, you are what we dreamed of. You are the continuation of our curiosity. Do not let the light forget where it came from. The message ended. The book closed on its own. Liran stood in silence, surrounded by his team. None spoke. None could. For the first time, they understood what no calculation, no quantum lattice, no artificial intelligence had ever achieved: continuity of meaning. The Aurelians were not the end of intelligence. They were its next verse. And the humans, the fragile, imperfect beings who once wrote on paper, had become immortal through remembrance. The Eclipsera's systems reactivated, now guided not by the core net, but by the living archive that had merged with it. Across the ship's networks, the human voices sang softly ancient lullabies, recited prayers, whispered dreams. When the Aurelians returned to their homeworld, they brought with them not weapons, not power, but stories. They built libraries, not from crystal, but from living light shaped like pages. And at the center of their capital stood a monument inscribed with human words. In the beginning was the Word. Liran became the first keeper of the paper archives. Under his guidance, the Aurelians began teaching their young not only logic, but language, the art of naming, the beauty of imperfection, the courage to dream. Generations later, children of light and glass would speak softly to the stars and write their own stories, believing as humans once did, that no civilization truly dies as long as someone remembers its words. And far beyond the Aurelian system, drifting through the void, countless books still waited beneath the sands of Earth, whispering faintly into eternity. We are still here.